Dr. Shifang Tzu to actually be here with us and convening as part of our platform to expand and share on ideas and thoughts and process towards working towards making the Biennale happen and deepen our research. So today, without further ado, Shifang Tzu is a lecturer at the Department of Communications and New Media Department, National University of Singapore. She is also a curator of the NUS Museum. Fang Tzu holds a PhD in Cultural Studies from the National University of Singapore. Her dissertation research was supported by the President's Graduate Fellowship and the FASS Promising Graduate Scholar Award. Her research interests include the formation of visual modernity, Cold War aesthetics, memory, philosophies of technology, and the embodiment of artistic practice in everyday life. Without further ado, this monthly event is supported by Plus Jakarta, Enjoy Jakarta, the Ministry of Education and Culture, SAM Fund for Art and Ecology, and jointly held with the Jakarta Arts Council. So thank you very much, and over to you, Fang Tzu.
Thank you so much, Qingyi, for your very kind introduction. I think my duty today is very much to lay a ground and also introduce my great honor to have the chance to have two of my, I would say, both intellectual, spiritual mentor in the past several years, Lucy Davis and Philippa Lovett. It's a wonderful occasion to very much, as a response, as I mentioned, a humble response to engage the conversation with the Jakarta Biennale's primus of this notion of together, but at the same time interrogation of the formation of history. So I may just quickly introduce both Lucy and Philippa. Lucy is a visual artist, art writer, and founder of the collective transdisciplinary, the Migrant Ecologies Project, which encircle more than human ecology, materiality, and memory in arts and culture. And our discussion today, which we are very graciously have Lucy here, allow us to mobilize and take advantage of having her around to mobilize her recent award-winning film, If You Bite Can Sing, The Wild One Will Come Like Shadow Through Leaf, as our focus to unpack some of the ideas today. In the meantime, we also have Dr. Philippa Lovett. Philippa Lovett is a lecturer in film study, a senior lecturer in film study. I'm so sorry.
No, just a lecturer. Sorry. Just a lecturer.
In film study at University of St Andrew, UK, where she's a co-director of Centre for Screen Culture and member of Centre for Energy Ethics. I should also ask her to share a few words of her recent publication in collaboration with Jessamine Tracy's on this particular very important anthology, Theorizing Region, Film and Video Culture in Southeast Asia. I think if we have enough time, and I really wish Dr. Philippa will also share a little bit of insight on, the very important dimension of oral history, as in conversation with Lucy's research-driven artistic project, also very much based on the oral history dimension. So I think without further ado, I should start to just ask both of you this very preliminary question, since I do believe this is a very great chance also for our audiences to understanding this background and premise on sound. May I just trouble both of you to share a little bit the personal trajectory, intellectual trajectory, artistic trajectory, what drove your interest to focusing on this intersection and a convergent point between political of sound, the politics of sound, and the aesthetic dimension of listening. Maybe we start with Lucy.
Oh, I was going to say Philippa.
I know.
This is one of the things I'd actually thought about in response to a question that Philippa sent us earlier, because the kind of my interest in sound also, or a crystallizing of my interest in sound goes together with the start of this project, really, and the way that found myself drawn into a bird zone by a particular bird that kind of intervened in my morning, where I was living just along the rail tracks, beside the rail tracks at Tanglin Halt, which is the site that is represented in this film. So I heard this one bird, and then that kind of, in and through listening and trying to figure out what that one bird was, I heard another bird, and then found myself drawn into this zone. I can go on about that, but I think I'll come back to it maybe with some of Philippa's questions later.
So my background, before I was an academic, I was a musician. And so something that I've kind of always been conscious of is a kind of what some sound theorists refer to as a sonic sensibility, is that I was always very conscious of sounds in my immediate environment. And I was very interested in the kind of potential of what it meant to play sounds and play music with other people, and I was very interested in the kind of potential of improvisation and collaboration from a musical perspective. And then when I started becoming interested in film theory, similarly, I was just drawn to the sound, and I wasn't really conscious of that. But when I started writing about sound, and in particular, this is when I was really interested in writing about films about history, Asian film, about history and about memory, and about the kind of the contestation between official memory, official history, and unofficial memories. So I was really interested in the way that filmmakers were using sound in ways in which that kind of allowed you to be able to tune into a kind of experience of space at a particular moment in time. So from that point, I started reading a lot about oral histories. So thinking about the ways in which soundscapes of particular moments in time kind of gave you a sense of the kind of phenomenological experience of that particular location at that particular time. So I was really interested in that kind of relationship between sound, history, memory, and phenomenology. And then that led me to the work of Stephen Feld, who's an anthropologist, acoustic anthropologist, and he was talking about, he's written a lot about sound as acoustomology, which is sound as a way of knowing and being in the world. So once I discovered Stephen Feld when I was writing my PhD, it opened up this incredible kind of rich area for me just to dive into, and I just felt like my kind of intellectual home, if you like. And I've kind of used that kind of concept of acoustic ecology in every aspect of my writing in different ways.
Would that be possible? I will trouble Philippa, maybe in a sense, to maybe unpack the idea of August terminology, but at the meantime, I think we can also, through that idea, coming back to, I think, Lucy's wonderful encounter with that kind of polyvocality of bird singing and urban history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that really, for me, if I'm approaching acoustic ecology from the perspective of a film theorist, I think the way that films use sound to really kind of create a sense of what it means to inhabit a certain space at a certain time, and the recognition that that kind of state of inhabitation is a process. It's not static. It's something that's always in flux and always changing, and one in which that is also very subjective. And so, you know, we might think about the way in which sound shapes social space, and it can be sound from kind of official voices. So it can be like state broadcasts, for example, through, you know, tannoy speakers, or through the radio, or through television. And that kind of creates space, lived space, in a very particular kind of way. But how we kind of subjectively relate to that space is different depending on our own kind of lived experience and our own situated position, if you like, our own position as a listener and as a hearer in that space. So I think that's one really interesting aspect that acoustic ecology allows us to think through, is our engagement with space, firstly, primarily as not one that is fixed and not one that is static, but as one that is always in negotiation with the other kind of factors that kind of feed into that space. So within that way of thinking about acoustic ecology as a way of knowing and being in the world that is very much kind of based on phenomenology and the senses, there's a way in which we can think about alternative ways of knowing that can be resistant to those kind of dominant kind of oral or acoustic kind of regimes. So I'm really, really interested in the way that filmmakers can kind of create space for these kind of points of resistance or moments of resistance through the way in which they kind of explore different aspects of sound.
Can I say something? Because Philippa asked a question. I'm jumping into one of your questions because I think it relates. She was actually talking about an interview that she'd read by with Zai Tang, who is the composer, sound designer for this film, and who is really a kind of equal collaborator, if you like, to well, we work together. Zai had said something about that you needed to slow down bird calls in order to really be able to hear them properly. So you could slow them down up to 10 times in order to get all the variations. And Philippa, you said something about, or asked something about whether it was even, whether perhaps humans were not supposed to hear everything in a bird call. And I find that question interesting, and I'd like to come back to that. But I also wonder, thinking about this zone, that I, as a total amateur, was kind of initiated into by this bird, whether we precisely do have these ways of knowing, even ways of listening, that we are just dulled. And that maybe we need to, attune ourselves to, and that this, precisely, and when you're talking about these ways of knowing as a form of resistance, they can also be a form of research, of experiencing the world, which takes us into a different sense of ecology. Sorry, I got distracted just then because my field is being interrupted by my partner, who is working outside, and I just need to close the door because I'm hearing him all the time, and I can hear him on the phone, and so I'm trying to focus. Anyway, I'll be back.
Maybe we can use this chance to maybe trouble Philippa. Can you just maybe also just quickly summarize that particular interview you read about Zai Tang, because I think it also will be very helpful for our audiences to have a little bit context about that particular interview. So yes, as we know,
I mean, I've taken some notes on the interview here, so I'm cheating a little bit by looking at it. But definitely, I think from the interview, the sense that I get is very much, as Lucy was saying there, as about a kind of this kind of point of resistance to these kinds of dominant regimes of listening as being a point that can be a part of our research as well. And certainly, from what he describes in this interview, that kind of mode of attunement is an ethical one, right? It's about kind of deliberately attempting to tune into certain frequencies, certain sounds, certain vocalizations that would otherwise be, sidelined, be marginal, be inaudible. But I think that he talks a little bit about scale and about how, this kind of mode of attunement is about tuning into the kind of micro rhythms, the micro rhythms, and the kind of the sonic sensibilities of more than human life that is quite distinct and different from the kind of rhythms and sounds that we might associate with capitalism. And I found it very interesting that he also talks about the Capitalocene in relation to this as well, which really kind of tunes in with some of my kind of research interests as well. And it's something that I want to kind of return to in my response to the film as well, is the way in which we can think of that as a kind of mode of resistance as well, to the kind of acoustic dominance of the capitalist scene that is both temporal, spatial, acoustic, and affects all aspects of life. So I think as well, what Zai talks about as well is the kind of concept of relationality is a kind of thinking about a kind of sonic encounters and relational encounters and ecological encounters being an ethical mode of engagement whereby, we can listen in, but as Lucy said, there are certain moments at which, sound is imperceptible to us for various different reasons, and what that means for us in relation to kind of human dominance in the context of the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene, and I think that this really is a question that speaks more broadly to, the theme of the Biennale as well, and thinking about, rights, human rights, of course, but also other rights. And I know that that's something that Lucy will be picking up on as well, in terms of land rights and other species rights within this, this broader ecology.
Maybe we should also take this opportunity to ask Lucy. This is a brilliant film. I think the focus of today's conversation is very much, can you just introduce the title? I mean, in a sense, I also want to take this opportunity. Yes, very long, but I think it's necessary. But in the meantime, also take this opportunity to also just introduce the film project, a research-driven film project, and how does that also kind of speak back I think in conversation with the mode of resistance. Then this wonderful notion of attunement Philippa mentioned in her response.
Yeah, I think I'm really grateful for that, Philippa, because it's something that I've struggled with in this project, in that the project from the get-go had an advocacy agenda, if you like, and yet it's also all of the iterations, and there are multiple iterations of this project that have been, I always lose count, I think it's 4 or 5 exhibitions, in 3 of which have been along the rail tracks at Tanglin Halt, and 32 short films, some parts of which then are in this short film now, and the work actually started in 2011, so it's been going on for a long time, and yeah, to get back to this sort of resistance, one of the the questions that recurs to me is, are we being too soft? What is the role, what is the role of this particular kind of aesthetic in a larger political context where these spaces are disappearing all the time, and Chingni knows very well, and so does Fang Se, that this is, the rail tracks, the rich, magical zone of urban scrub along the rail tracks at Tanglin Halt is only one of many of these sites across Singapore that are disappearing. So I'm thinking about this attunement now, thanks to Philippa, and it's something that I'll take with me. I guess if to talk about a strategy, I mean, you never start with a work and say, I'm going to use this strategy, right? You just start. But retroactively thinking, if there are certain strategies coming out of this combination of exhibitions and films, one might be, I guess, an allure, a bait. I mean, the title of this film is "If Your Bait Can Sing, the Wild One Will Come," and that is a quote from one of our interviewees, who as a young boy used to catch birds in Fort Canning, which is a kind of central site in central Singapore, and as part of the interview was telling us about the various times that he's been out catching birds in his life and the kinds of traps that he uses, and then also the kind of way in which one has to listen to the site in order to catch a bird. And there's a quotation from him also in the film. And so we really, or I really felt that phrase kind of alludes to so much. And that's why at the last minute, although the film was supposed to be called Like Shadows Through Leaves, which is our form of storytelling, this other phrase kind of came in on the top. And so if you can, so kind of thinking with Pak Rahim, one could maybe see the work that we do as a kind of bait, in that it's, you know, it's alluring, I hope, and poetic and joyful at the same time as it's grief work. So, you know, these songs and both the bird calls, the people songs, there's a part of which is grief work, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But there's also something that's very, I hope, very joyful in this approach. That it's a kind of celebration, and I guess it's that kind of joy or poetic celebration that I hope draw my, you know, in my head, you know, that the MP with whom we've had quite a lot to do with in the area, I mean, he doesn't have very much power, but, you know, maybe he sees it and he shows it to somebody else and they somehow begin to get it, so that even if Tanglin Halt, you know, the area around Tanglin Halt and that intersection between residents who have lived there for the past 50 years and have been engaging with this site, not just the birds, but they planted the trees that the birds now come to, that this is so rich and so precious, and that, you know, bulldozing it all and putting up condos and then replanting trees is not going to cut it. I don't know, that was a long ramble. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I didn't talk very much about the context, but maybe I can do that later. Fangse, how was it?
Yes, I think it's an excellent response. But I think in the meantime, because there's so much wonderful, I would say, concept, approach, and methodology that can be further unpacked. I think my role just take the head of student back here and, you know, ask all these questions. I mean, in a sense, even the mode of attunement or the ethics of attunement, there's several writings about it. I just also want to ask Philippa, like right here, because the definition I got from Elisabeth Lepari, right? That wonderful book called Listening, Thinking, Being Towards an Ethic of Attunement. I'm just looking at this quotation from her book, her definition of attunement, ethics of attunement, and here I quote her, and ethics of attunement and awareness and attention to a harmonic interconnectivity of all being and the object. And I believe, like, throughout this conversation, I think you and Lucy have very much moving, I think also transcend this idea of ethics of attunement, expanded to more than, I think that's the right term, more than human is very much need to be addressed here. As Lucy mentioned, maybe it's not just post-human, it's all the way more than human. So maybe I could trouble also Philippa to just unpack again, like coming back to this, I think very important, I think positioning of both writing, art making, and even just listening, right? How were you, in a sense also coming back to Lucy's work, how were you response to this mode of attunement? And also this is also including indecipherable moment of not able to understand bird singing in Zaitan's case.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that book. I think it's a really, you know, wonderful book in lots of ways. And but I would say that I think that the quote that you pulled out there, I wonder if the kind of leaning towards harmony is perhaps overly romantic. I think that a mode of attunement needs to be open to disharmony, needs to be open to ruptures, needs to be open to things that are difficult for us to listen to. Like listening should be difficult. You know, listening and attuning to the world around us should not be one that is readily consumable. And I think that's a really important kind of political and ethical way in which you know, certain kind of geographers who are writing about sound, Ame Kanixia, sorry, I probably completely mispronounced their surname rather, talks about that in really wonderful ways, in which you know, I actually attended a listening session that they ran a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about the ways in which they kind of set as listening exercises to do. So again, I was a student again, thanks, and I really loved that opportunity to be a student. And so, yeah, they set as listening exercises and to go to the same place every day at the same time, ideally, and write down our responses, write down what it felt like, what we kind of learned, I guess, from that experience of listening. And one thing, I went to the same place every day on the beach, which is a place I go all the time for walks. And usually I go with my dogs, and usually they're running around and barking and asking me to throw the ball. And, you know, there's families around, there's, you know, people laughing and chatting. But the sound is different every day, you know, even if you go at the same time, it's always different. But during this listening exercise, I decided not to take the dogs. I decided just to go by myself. And I went and sat on a rock, which is sometimes at different times of the day covered, you know, because it's a tidal kind of, obviously with the tidal situation, sometimes you can't sit on the rock because the sea's in and things like that, the tide's in. But it just so happens that every time I was there at that day, I was able to sit on the rock. And something that I was really conscious of is the way that I became, because I wasn't distracted by the other things like throwing a ball for dogs or being in conversation with anybody, I was really, really conscious of the kind of idea of relationality, the idea of my presence in the space, perhaps changing the space. So there was some oyster catchers and some eider ducks, particularly the eider ducks I noticed, who were kind of swimming nearby, and there's a whole community of them that you always see there all the time, and their soundings, their vocalizations are amazing, because they always sound like they're having such a kind of animated conversation, and sometimes they sound like they're laughing. And obviously I'm kind of I you know, have the tendency to kind of project, kind of anthropomorphize their conversations, I guess. But I was very, very conscious of the fact that, you know, initially they didn't move, they just continued, you know, floating on the water and chatting. But then I became conscious of the fact that it was almost like, oh, that guy's come, we'll kind of move around the corner so we can get our space. So I was really, really conscious of my presence changing what the sounds of that space were, even though I was completely still and quiet. So that was one thing that I really noticed. The other thing that I really noticed was the way in which listening is not just purely something that you do through your ears, but it's something that I was very conscious of. And this is something that Kanixia talks about as well, is how, and we talked about this in the kind of feedback sessions in the listening group. I was really conscious of my hands on this ancient stone, and I felt as though I was listening through my hands, you know. And you know, people have talked about, you know, listening through the soles of your feet and listening through, and I was so, it's a kind of theoretical idea that I've never really thought about before. I mean, obviously we listen, we hear through our skin, we feel vibrations, we feel a kind of, listening is by, and hearing is by definition a very kind of embodied physical sensation. But there was something different about this experience, something very different about the kind of the stone, the kind of weight of time in the stone, and that kind of sense of permanence and temporality and transience. So as the birds moved away, because they chose to move away from, maybe because I was there, maybe for other reasons, you know, I'll never know, and I should never know, it's not my right to know. But also there's a really interesting, from a kind of temporal perspective, about the kind of the time of the stone, and the fact that that stone will exist far beyond my existence and existed far in advance of my existence. So I became very, very conscious of this kind of question of relationality as a mode of ethical attunement through listening that is not about listening to words and not about listening to semantics, you know, but it was about a different sensorial and entirely embodied experience that allowed me to gain a sense of some kind of understanding of my position within the world at that moment. And that is a temporary experience, it's a transient experience, but in that moment, you know, that's what I see as a kind of ethical attunement. But I would say as well that, you know, in terms of the quote that you pulled out from Laspari, the kind of tendency to think about sound from a kind of harmony perspective, I think, you know, might have made me kind of say something like, oh, I felt, you know, harmonious with the, you know, in tune with the environment. I'm not in tune with the environment. And I think that is the Anthropocene, right? Is we are not in tune. Capitalism, human presence, human activity within the world has meant that we are not in tune with the environment. And that's that kind of disharmony that I'm interested in, and the friction that Anna Singh talks about.
Exactly. Yeah. I was just going to say friction. Yeah. Philippa, that's so beautiful. But I mean, apart from that, I mean, it is. But the complexity of what you're saying is so beautiful. And have you written about that experience?
I'm writing about it at the moment in my book. So.
It's just such an evocative anecdote. Thank you so much for that. I was thinking about elephants as well, you know, and I mean, of course, you know, that the elephants listening through their feet. That this is precisely this, and to sort of get back to the point I was trying to make, which is not that one should colonize all beings by learning to listen to them in all their specificity, but that we might be able to tune in more than we actually, or we might already be tuning in more than we're actually aware of, through our skin, through our feet. You know, there are these things happening to us that maybe we can try and also to tune into a bit more.
That reminds me of a really great example, because Franksa had asked me to kind of talk about maybe some other examples from Southeast Asia, and the one I really wanted to mention was I recently interviewed Akrichalam, who's the sound designer for Epichapong's films, and it was an amazing experience interviewing him, and he talked about Tropical Malady, which is my absolute favorite film of all time. If I could dive into Tropical Malady and live there forever, I would. That's a weird thing to say, but that's kind of my experience of it. Yeah. So basically, in the interview, he talked about when he was recording the sound for Tropical Malady, and they were out in the jungle, and he described the kind of process of being still as being like stone, and he was saying that that's how he kind of thinks about it, is being like stone. And actually it was interesting, Zai Tang talks about how he moves and walks around the space and moves around the space when he's doing field recording. But I was very, very taken by this idea of being like stone. And one of the examples that he talked about is the way, and this really allowed me to think about this idea of what is imperceptible to us, inaudible to us, and about how that really makes us think about this question of relationality and the kind of right to hear, and anyway, he talks about recording the space, but then later he realizes that there was a herd of elephants following them and behind them the entire time, and they only realized when they left the space of the jungle and looked behind them and saw them. But they had been completely silent, even though they had been really, really close. And the elephants were clearly listening to them, right? And I love what you said there about elephants listening to their feet, because it's such a kind of evocative sound. And he says lots of other really interesting things about that film as well. But just that kind of moment made me think about a question of relationality and who's doing the listening.
Yes, yeah.
think even come back to the idea of filmmaking. Since we are talking about, we are discussing Lucy's film work. I think the earlier piece, earlier work, Jalan Jati itself, is also just such a sonically rich, and that deliberate decision of any synchronicity also allow us to, I would say, experience the work or reading the work beyond just the harmonious synchronicity between the viewing experiences and the listening experiences. I mean, would that be possible also for Lucy to just, since you are the conceptualizer of both film, I mean, will you be possible, would you mind to share a little bit more on, I mean, in a sense, how from, I know you hate this word director, but what's the conversation usually happen when you are in collaboration with artists such as Zaitan, who have been working with you in with the as a research group under the name of Migrant Ecologies Project, and also you have Zai Kuning for the Jalan Jati piece.
Yeah, I think the two, I mean, both in both the sound is an equal partner to the image, if not more, the kind of more compelling actor in both films. But the way that we worked in both films is very different. For Jalan Jati, it was Zai Tang who really put everything together, and he did it almost independently. So we really kind of went off in completely different directions, and then he came back, and things just happened to dance. So, you know, for people who don't know, the Jalan Jati was about an aesthetic of wood, or was kind of trying to develop a way of filmmaking that was, if you like, of wood, in order to talk about timber, trees, and relationships to timber and trees in both Singapore and in Muna Island, Southeast Sulawesi. And so Zai there really, you know, he totally went in his own direction and kind of improvised his own score together with the voice of Zai Kuning for that film. Whereas in this film, although Zai's field recordings have been an independent process, the actual sound design has been a much tighter dialogue, and we kind of feed off each other. So what you've got in this film is you have these layerings of bird call, human voice, human calling as bird, environmental sounds that kind of go together. And we really did talk about, in each case, the particular mix that we wanted from it. I mean, it was Zai's idea, and he did it really beautifully to select utterances, human utterances, for their sound, as much, if not more, than for their meaning, and then put them together with certain bird calls. But then we kind of ran with it, and so it was really you know, we would just go through every single section and think about, and also the silences, and how much silence you needed in order to really listen to what was coming next. That was a much tighter dialogue. Yeah, there's something I want to say about, but I haven't really formulated yet. I want to say something, so I'm going to say it and then I'll come back to it later, about this nexus of passionate but dissonant, if you like, encounters, which is what makes this place so magical. That, you know, it's precisely not all peace and love and hanging out under the tree and listening to birds, but there is this kind of complexity in this site, which is what it's contested, and to go back to the kind of the bait, what I hope the film does is that it calls you in but I hope that contestedness is still there as well, that friction, if you like, in the experience, and that also comes out in some of the sound layering. Did I answer your question? Did I do?
No, yeah, I think that's great, because I mean, in a sense, it also allows us to see. I think it's very much also to see how the method or approach has been very different, evolve with its situatedness, because obvious shuttle-like through leaf. I mean, it's obvious a very different piece. Yeah. It's a very different work. Although I agree, I think the notion of fiction in relation to kind of capitalist scene narration of history is still consistently there. I mean, in a sense, how the capitalism became the central motor, and when something needs to move, it could not move without having a sense of fiction. If it's just smooth surfaces, things doesn't work, right? Things doesn't move forward.
But even beforehand, even beforehand, right. there's there are contested, passionate but contested interests in this site, which were in their own way working themselves out, right? So there are bird poachers. I mean, they're called bird poachers. People who've been, going out on a May Day and catching birds to sell to the local market, and they've been doing that since the 1950s, just like you would go fishing. And then there's the nature rights, the nature society groups who, of course, are against the bird poachers. And those conversations are already, if you like, feeding into that. We're already feeding into that site and working themselves out in their own way before the changes came about. Yeah. So it's precisely, it's a kind of, if you like, I don't want to say positive, but productive, contested site that gives it that energy, if you like. Am I making sense?
No, completely. I think that's exactly what I've been thinking about when I'm writing up, like make up this blurb. Kind of speculatively thinking about how all this conversation goes. But at the meantime, it's precisely that the choice of referred to the notion of convergence. I have very different idea, even though I read this work on convergence, but I was thinking about precisely what we don't really see is it's a complete narrative. Is in fact, so whether it's the metaphoric fiction or the physical contestation of various manifesting moments of rights, what we in fact witness or heard or couldn't hear is precisely the operation of power. And that is not singularly thinking from the state, because obviously Singapore is the context, and we tend to be very naively thinking from the perspective of like Foucauldian dominance of governance. But obviously it's a way more complex story. Have all these different agents, historical players being part of it. So I think that's the reason why I choose that term with so-called posthuman convergence. But after exchange notes with all of you, I mean, yeah, I think that also has a sense of limit, thinking about the lineage, kind of linear understanding of history that may be somehow the more than human could be more precise and correct in this particular context. I mean, in the meantime, I think that's the reason why we begin this conversation before we start this Zoom chat. we've been contemplating on this notion of rights.
Yeah, sorry to butt in here, but also like so you were talking about, you know, the post-human rights itself and whether to be more than human. So my question here is that the human that we're taking is perfectly able, has a totally, what we're envisioning, like in this, like, you know, there's the question of listening versus hearing, the active and the passive of it, which is something that's like continuously being brought up in terms of like neuroscience, in terms of mindfulness therapy, actually, to consider. But to speak of listening, there is a very interesting thing, because you talk about being more than human and actually listening to sounds that are imperceptible to a normal fit human being. And one of the examples that I want to like kind of bring up is the question of the percussionist Evelyn Glennie. She was deaf by the age of 12, and she actually listens to percussion in terms of like vibrations on the floor and through her lower half of her body itself. And my question here, I guess, would be the question is, are we really looking for a fully abled post-humanism, or are we just looking for a different mode of listening that we are not used to, that we're not used to actually training and thinking about? And whether like this, in the case of like, you know, Dr. Glennie, it's a matter of a compensation of a different sense, like auditory and using the body. Yeah. And whether the category of like post-human is a bit too presumptuous, perhaps, to think about a fully abled human being.
I think this putting the percussion and vibration aside, sorry because I don't want to bring back to thinking about the situated humanness in this conversation. I think thinking about Lucy's work and thinking about, I mean, Philippa's writing, in thinking her writing on Southeast Asia. I mean, especially I'm referring to Philippa's writing on Vietnam and environmental crisis, particular essay published in Southeast Now. I think my unsettling feeling with the post-human is, in fact, to urge or encourage a critique on humanism, on humanity itself. So it's not so much about we move beyond or, you know, deconstruct, but is to envision what were the assemblage of the coexistence and the relational dynamic could be through listening. So I think that's why Philippa being quite precisely used that term right at the beginning of introduce mode of listening, the acousmatic epistemology is a way of knowing to listening, and that more than embodiment, it's obvious not just about, you know, synchronization between senses, but it's very much to reconsider your counterpart or someone in your in the same shared sphere. You have absolutely no right to understand this species co-share this sphere with you. And I think that brings us back to a lot of post-colonial writing as well, the kind of opaque, right? The opaque in kind of Jamaica literature and relational poetic as well. So I think that's why one of the premises, speculative premises or imaginative premises, is to really very much think about human position and how we reconsider the right very much from anthropocentric understanding in lots of conversation. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
But I agree with Chinyi, if I understand correctly, that these posts do kind of carry with them this sort of sense of arrival, or and this is one the conversation that we also had, right? This sort of linear progression. So even though it's not really about coming to some kind of superhuman state, there is this this assumption of arrival somehow in a post, which is why I prefer them more than human. And also, for me, it's also a recognition of these things that have always been going on, right? That these ways of connecting or not connecting, inside and outside of our bodies, the bacteria inside us, and so forth, have always been. It's not a linear progression. It's a way of thinking about humanity's position in the world, which includes the things that we should not hear, but also includes the ways in which we are connecting, have always been connecting. Hi, Hugo.
I think that leads us to consider that initial conversation on rights. I think Lucy was, I think is Lucy or Philippa? I think it's in Philippa's email or Lucy's email mentioned about. It's the correspondence, right? Like the conversation on. Because when we think about rights, it's obvious a written document or a social contract. Mm. Or at the meantime, when we think about human rights, that's even more problematic. Mm. That when someone, I think Arendt's idea, Hannah Arendt's idea on being people, and that very moment of critique on the human rights, that you need to be a citizen, but then what happens if there's a displacement happen? So the question should be how will different mode of listening or a proposal for an ethical attunement allow us to articulate the rights beyond human, or would that be possible? I think it's obvious a very speculative kind of proposition here, but I do like to hear both Lucy and Philippa to kind of engage with this. Is either debate or is either
I don't know that it's completely speculative, because there are mountains and rivers, and increasingly across the world, more and more non-humans are being given rights, legal rights, forests, trees, and so forth. But what I really find interesting is that in this the right not to be understood, is that how that. So because the rights discourse in a way is also about visibility. I mean, there's an ocular centrism to rights discourse and the politics of visualization, right? And so that you have this right to be, you have to kind of be seen before you have a right. And now we're thinking about the acoustics and the sort of to be heard before one has a right, or to be listened to before one has a right, which again kind of brings it back to the human subject as the listener. But what is so interesting in what Philippa's proposing is there's this kind of displacement. So it's the bird's right not to be understood. And how does that get articulated legally? When so much of our rights discourse is about precision, right? It's about identification. It really goes back to the kind of the colonial gaze, or here if we say listen, ear, that pins and mounts and decontextualizes in order to understand, and everything has to be seen in all of its you know, all of its precision. So there's an interesting, you know, if one was going, you know, how would one then extend that discourse of rights to a right not to be heard by another, on the part of another species, or not to be seen? That opaqueness that you're talking about, Fang Su.
I think that's what the kind of fantastic thing about sound as a research method, but also as part of your creative practice, is that, you know, it allows you to, you know, engage with those kinds of questions. And I think that was something that I really wanted to hear from you, Lucy, about, you know, the kind of ethical questions around, you know, I was reading about what you'd written about making the work, about the kind of connections you saw with kind of visual culture, and about the kind of idea of photography of birds having those connections with, you know, hunting and kind of colonial categorizations. So, I mean, obviously there's a really fascinating tension there. And I think that, you know, I just would really like to hear you talk about like the process of how you kind of thought through those ethical questions as you were making the work.
I don't know if I've completely thought them through, but I don't know if I have that capacity, but certainly in terms of visual, yes. And let me just have a look now at what I wrote in response to you this morning. Ching, 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 ching. Where did she say that? Yeah, the representational ethics. I mean, I don't know if we're off the hook with it, but yeah, there's two things going on, because there's the like shadows through leaves, there's the kind of storytelling like shadows through leaves, which in itself is a little bit elusive, and it's intentionally, the idea of storytelling like shadows through leaves when translated into sound is like hearing a fragment of a conversation, or like when a bird flies past and you just get a little bit of the call and then it flies off again, but it kind of that moment of contact kind of resounds. But that then visually also feeds into the kind of ephemeral way that aesthetic of the film feeds into, yes, a more conscious attempt to think about how we might represent these birds. And there are birds kind of in the background flying backwards and forwards, but there's none of the birds in the calls that are shown directly in the film. They're all shown through shadows and puppets, and that was a strategy that kind of came out of this critique of both the kind of predatorial colonial way of representing flora and fauna of the region, and all the images that we've grown up with of these extremely beautiful petrified illuminated creatures with a white background, completely decontextualized. So I knew we wanted to contextualize, and that's where these kind of returns, this almost pilgrimage-like returns to the site with these shadow puppets took place, and contextualize again with the shadows, with the leaves. So you've got this kind of shadow and memory, but there's something to do with illusion in there, which I've not completely worked out, and what an illusion is as opposed to a representation. And I'm sorry if this is sounding vague, but there is a difference. There's a difference there, and of course, a shadow is an illusion, and then of course there's the continuation of that logic, that predatorial capitalist logic in competitive bird photography, which was all around us while we were shooting. There were birders right there beside us with these mega lenses, and so a way to kind of and a way to come back to the friction, or to come back to kind of working with the trouble, if you like, to recognize that although we are very critical of that, that, you know, high definition visual culture and the mega lenses and 30 photographers around a tiny little bird that's just flown in from Siberia. As you know, if I want to know what a bird is, I will go online and I will consume that very visual culture that I'm so critical of. So I am a consumer of that visual culture, and these kind of shadow puppets where we printed out random images that we'd found online, took them back to the site. That was kind of a way to deal with that complexity, if you like. That's a sound. I'm sorry that that's a sound, a visual example, and I'm still thinking about the ways that kind of translates into sound. But
yeah, I think no. I mean, I don't apologize. I think that's a great answer, because something that I was thinking about was the kind of idea that sometimes sound recordists talk about, the idea of kind of capturing a sound. And I think that, you know, some people who've kind of written about, or who are sound practitioners themselves, have kind of really resisted that idea of capturing a sound, because a sound is different depending on where you hear it, right? It's never the same sound. You can't just grab a sound, put it in your bag and play it somewhere else. It's always a process of mediation. So this word capture, I think, is a really interesting one. But then, of course, when you're thinking about poetry, you can think about capturing an essence of something, and that means something entirely different. So I think there's a really interesting way in which, you know, we can think about the ways of, you know, as you were saying, they're kind of, I can't remember the word you used actually, but you said it really beautifully, but just this kind of, I guess the kind of the not grabbing nature of image and sound, that you can kind of create, you can kind of experience a sense of it in a way that is a kind of potentially abstract sense, but that is not necessarily always a case of extracting and possessing and grabbing. It can be a sense of touch, right? You can never, you can't possess it, but you can touch it, or you can be beside it momentarily. And I think that those, resonance. I mean, that's just the beauty of sound, is to think about resonance in that way, that is not about possession, but is about being with. And I think that in the context of all these kind of ideas around, you know, environmental crisis, extinction, being with, as Donna Haraway says, you know, staying with the trouble, is precisely around these tensions of and these kind of senses of being alongside, being with, without grabbing, without possessing.
I think, Philippa, you remind me of a beautiful passage in the Staying with the Trouble, which is about storytelling. I think Haraway used this very interesting pictorial expression on cradling cats. So in a sense, Chin, you can demonstrate for our audiences right there. I mean, in a sense, it's right. It's not holding it, but when you have another hand coming to, you know, because cats is also constantly moving, but when you have coming to, you know, holding it, it's almost, it's not grabbing, it's also not holding, but it's to avoid it to fall down to potential dangerous or potential cats should forbidden to having more dinner right there. I mean, whatever senses. But I think that's I think what we're trying to capture there is what will possibly be this more human storytelling be. I think one of a beautiful poetic proposal from Lucy is this shadowing to leave, right? But in the meantime, also, like going back to Donna Haraway's writing, is this cat cradling processes right there with a sense of care, obvious. Chi, are you going to demonstrate to everyone?
Do you mean like just holding him up like that and then cradling the lower back and the lower legs?
And passing.
And passing, yes.
Well, I can't do the passing thing right now, so it's a bit hard to. But like the analogy of cradling cats are kind of interesting because, like, you know, the physiology of physiology of cats is that if they jump off a lower height, they actually break more of their bones as opposed to like one that's like above, I think, 7 floors.
What?
Yeah, there is a minimum height they need to attain
it's
in
true.
order to
For
I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Learning new things every day.
How are we doing? Are we okay for time?
More than okay with time. Yeah. But I'm also like kind of interested in like what you were talking about, because like in some ways, like, you know, Lucy, before the talk you were asking about like how do we map, like, do sites have rights as well?
Oh yeah, so I got lost there because I think that was one of my answers I was supposed to make, and then I got lost. Yeah, so yeah, I was thinking about, you know, a site like Tanglin Halt, right, that has where you have plants that have been planted by residents who've lived there for almost all their lives, plants that have been flown in by birds that are collected by migrant workers because they recognize them from their hometowns, that there is this kind of ecology of humans and non-humans which has layered and become very rich over time. And is it possible, you know, that, you know, this is not primary rainforest, and this is not you know, Angkor Wat, this is not a sacred site, but would it be possible to use rights discourse to talk about the importance for all these beings of this intersection, of this particular time layered intersection, you know, in a modern city, not just ancient stuff. Or you know, is there a way that we can give value to this that somehow talks to rights discourse? I think that's what I was asking. And then Grace, you were talking about the rights of the dead, right? When we were talking earlier before we started, and whether, you know, there can be and this is something that you get a lot in Southeast Asia, right? The graveyards that are being dug up because there has to be development, but that, you know, where do those kinds of rights fit in to the non-human, to the ecology, the spirit ecologies? Yeah, do spirit ecologies have rights, and how would they be articulated?
Posthuman. I would also think, like, in one of the venues of the for the Jakarta Biennale exhibition, there are life-size dioramas that supposedly, I don't know, tell you how the space was being used initially. The site is now called National Awakening Museum. It was previously called Stovia, the first medical doctors for natives. They even call it the Java doctors. And if you now go there, you see all sorts of attempts of self-historicizing, I guess, using the dioramas, life size. We don't really know if it really happened there, but they sort of convince us by putting all these objects there. And there are also not only life-size dioramas in actual sites, or what they would what they would historicize as the actual site, but also like smaller dioramas, like something you see through glass. Different ways of sort of representing facts to convince you that this was how it operates. And in these dioramas, of course, you see human figures, and makes you wonder if we now, for example, in this conversation, we have to ask you if you allow us to record, if you would allow us to publish and all that. What about all these people that are there in like, sort of attempt to really create them, freeze them, capture them in this like one exact moment that you also see reproduced in various photographs. So you not only see the dioramas, you see there are different dioramas of like in different sites talking about this particular moment because it's noted as the national awakening. And various illustrations of all these people that never have consented to be part of that story. To be represented in that, yeah. And yeah, how are we going to deal with that? I mean, the exhibition need to happen around these things. There is a chance to sort of like hide them all as much as we can, but also what does it say about us if we, I think it will be really tough if we go into graves. Yeah.
No, but Grace, I do think it's such a wonderful and very generous and honest sharing on this important venue itself. I mean, contemporary curatorial practice is obvious a response to the site. And possibly that curatorial space is to, the differences between space is, an ongoing processes. It's not a fixed like place. There's a difference is fundamentally if we going back to human geography kind of theorization. So I think those are wonderful questions and very generous sharing on this entanglement, ethical decisions with the venue itself. And I think I speak so closely to, I would say, also the heart of Lucy's practice and Philippa's work, because one of the key terms has been mentioned by both of them is the grief work. And why grief work? I mean, of course, we can unpack the term further, but it's obvious, I think, for Lucy, Lucy's concern on tunneling hole, it's you don't really want to fall into a dramaturgy of representation and, trap in this nostalgic economy.
Yes, mausoleum. Yeah. No, totally.
But then what will you do? You have a history in front of you. You have both ethical and professional responsibility to engage with it. And what will be the option instead of fetishizing it or shying away from it? I believe none of you will do that. I have 100% confidence on your wonderful curatorial team. But then what will be the option? What will be the potential? What will be the opportunity of also thinking about engagement, right? If it's not a fetishization of the past, which is a capital his story, then what would that be? And what are the dimensions? What are the factors? What are the living, non-living storytelling agents need to be engaged in these processes?
I wanted to ask, I think that's such a brilliant question and such an important one. And I wanted to ask Lucy, kind of related to grief work and related to this question of precarity. Lucy, I wanted to kind of ask you about that in relation to the process, to duration. The fact that you've returned to this site. This is you didn't just kind of drop in and drop out. But this is a long engagement with this space. And I was really interested across the different works that are part of this project about the idea of repetition, but also transformation.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted just to invite you to talk a little bit about that, and if you see that as part of grief work in this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and also a way of trying to understand, right? That I mean, there's been repetition in the Stories of Wood project as well, where it's been kind of doing the same thing again and again and again and again in order to somehow hope that something but in this case there was the both the recording of sound and also the shadows were involved these pilgrimages. We call them pilgrimages kind of tongue-in-cheek because, you know, we didn't go like this, but you know, they were, right? We go back to the GPS point, the site where the bird was last seen or heard, and then there's a kind of a waiting, and in our case it was waiting for the sun, because we were shooting a lot of the time in the haze, so there was the forest smoke coming in from Riau and Sumatra, and there wasn't actually much sun around, so we couldn't even create these shadows. And so there were these kinds of rituals that would then come about. Yating was learning breakdancing at the time, and so she would have these sun dances that she'd be practicing. I mean, she was just practicing, but then after a while we began to call it sundance. So, you know, it's a ritual that kind of came about through those kinds of those going to those places. And now those places, certainly for us, are the places, so that, you know, when I see them in the film, I see that leaf, it's like, that's where that happened, that's where that happened. They become so situatedly, sort of personally marked. But there's a series of kind of returning to Tanglin Halt, which isn't just about grief work. We did there were three exhibitions in that area. The one was well, the first one was kind of actually when I had to leave Singapore, and we had an exhibition in my house, and then we also planted some of the plants that had particular resonance to us and to the arts community in Singapore. There were banyan cuttings from the substation that got planted along the rail tracks and so forth. So there was a kind of ritual there. And the first showing of some of the photographic works, the shadow photographic works, which you've got behind Chinyi and Grace. It's still from the film, but it's also a photograph. And a series, also some of the nests that we used in the film, the earlier films, we actually left them along the sides of the track. So there was a kind of process to kind of leave them there as well. But then there was the second exhibition, which was actually in Tanglin Halt, in a residence committee building, which was a very different kind of return, if you like, because that was very much for the residents, and it's still my favorite of all the exhibitions, because the community was still very much alive there, people were still living there, and they just totally took it over. And it kind of became a hangout place, and there were certain people who would come and leave their kids there. Some people brought their birds there. We had one guy's bird got stuck inside one of the nests, and it took us about an hour to get it out again because it just wanted to stay inside this nest. And so there was this whole, you know, really a kind of quite fierce sense of ownership of that space, and that our kind of intervention just completely got took over, and we have elderly ladies coming along and telling us that they didn't like the one part of the exhibition. Yeah, it's nice, but that bit you need to trim it a bit, it's a bit of a mess. And you know, so it was just so wonderful. And that is also, you know, that kind of sense of community and sort of relaxedness is something that also comes about after 50 years, people having lived in a site for 50 years and feeling, you know, confident enough to walk up to anybody and say, what the hell are you doing? What is this all about? And, you know, that it really was quite wonderful. So that's not, in a way, that one, you know, that I guess that's the most celebratory, if you like, of the exhibitions. And then in the film, there's also another return, which is a return of a scale model of the Chap Lao Chu, the 10-story HGVs that we put in the site where they actually were before for the purpose of the film. It was these HGV. They've also been in other exhibitions as well, and so there's a kind of return there where we the actors that are in the film are all residents, so they're people that we've interviewed, and we didn't really direct people very much, and or at least some of them. So the cardboard box collector, the rag and bone seller, who you see kind of going through the he was really, he's kind of like, okay, this is where this used to happen, this is where, and you can kind of see him. And we made that, some people have said that that particular shot is too long, but for us, we just find it so wonderful, because he really is, he's kind of making sense of his self, his life, his site, the site, and this is this, and this is this, and counting them. It's again a kind of, if you like, a process of ownership of that site, but as a memory. And so that final installation is in a way a part of grief work, in that it's it's a kind of ceremony, but I hope also that it's somehow metamorphosizing, or that the end of the film is not, it's not a funeral pyre, it's something that is kind of percolating and becoming inside inside those blocks, those housing blocks. The end of the film has these housing blocks inside a tent, and there's lights going on and stuff, and sounds of things hatching, I hope. So all that to say that, yes, there are these series of returns. There's the return, the returns with the, and also a series of listening. And I wrote down the different kinds of, where are they? The different kinds of listening and going back to returns, that you have these interventions where you have a bird that kind of flies through, and then you go back to try and find that site where the bird was, where you heard that call. And then there's the everyday interactions with residents that we also had in this process, this very long process from 2011 onwards. And then these kind of more dedicated walks, listening walks, which are more kind of formal, if you like. And then Zai, I'm just listing these off now. Zai and a drama teacher also did these workshops where they were working with school children and listening to the stories that the school children asked their parents and grandparents about the site and their relationship to the site and to birds. And then these more formal interviews. And then at the end, of course, at the end of the interview, or after the interview, or during the exhibition, there's also these kind of haphazard chats where residents come back again, and then there's this process of kind of transformation going on through all these different kinds of conversations, listening moments, walking, which I don't know whether you would call them ritual, but over time they become it. Yating was just breakdancing, but then after a while it became a fun dance. I don't know if that
yeah,
is...
That's a great answer. That's so fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I really like you use all these words, ritual, paragraph. I mean, more or less have that religious, dimension. It's and you I think you accidentally or deliberately, I couldn't tell, but I think precisely and wonderfully pointed out spirit ecology. Yeah, I can help to maybe just make a suggestion for Grace. I think one of the major projects will probably find a spirit medium to be part of the processes.
Never thought of it, but possible.
Yeah.
Possible. I've been getting lots of I don't know, suggestions. Like if I have questions on like, so I research on dead artists. If I have questions, I've had suggestions like, you know, we can summon them and you can interview them. Like,
that's such a fascinating way of like conjuring history and through like a different lens altogether. Like, it's also like something that transcends that linearity of time as well, right? Like, you know, how we're a certain reference point, you know, in this person's interpretation actually channel to like, you know, contemporary time. Just hold on a moment. Hey, sorry. Actually translate through that. And also the question about like grief work that we talked about, like Lucy, you spoke about it. There's also like the question of like, you know, what is the primary loss and what is the secondary loss, you know, when we think about grief work. And in terms like so nicely that you articulate about ideas of like the secondary loss, which is not often seen, seen in part of the prevalent way of working. Like very often, like when you think about primary loss, it's like the very distinct and abrupt action moment itself. Like here you have also like spoken about like how it teases out its, teases out by itself. And I'm just wondering, in grief work itself, there's always like other steps and cycles that you go through. And if there is a way that you would also think about it as recuperating like all of this like secondary losses itself into a story, or whether there is a endpoint to its step.
I don't think there's, can I answer that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I don't think there's an endpoint, which is not to flatten everything as part of this divine transformation, and it doesn't really matter that there's capitalism, doesn't really matter that Tanglenholt goes, because it'll all, you know, become something else. However, things, you know, maybe part of our work is what goes into that transformation that is to come, and what, you know, what do we remember and take with us in a transformation. So, you know, it's not a kind of fatalistic this is a process, and, you know, it'll all figure itself out, and then the jungle will come back again, and all that. But no, I don't think there is an end point. And this is where grief work, I think it's, you know, I think the words that we've been using, mausoleum, museum, the grief process that I hope we're doing is precisely not about, you know, petrifying something so that we can kind of hold on to it in this sort of permanent death, but that somehow some of the interconnection, some of the magic, some of the energy of what was can somehow influence and be remembered and be taken forward in a different iteration or a different transformation. So it's and also joyfully. I mean, I think also when I'm thinking about grief work, I think very much about, I have Deborah Birdrose in my head all the time, and her work with that essay Shimmer, with the flowering and the bats, and the kind of that moment and the subtitle of Deborah Birdrose's essay Shimmer is that when all you love is being trashed. All your love is being trashed. So it's a celebration of this particular moment in Australian, a particular season where there's a flowering and a shimmer in the air, and these bats are going crazy. At the same time as that whole ecology and that whole lifestyle that kind of celebrates this shimmer, this season of shimmer, is being destroyed. But somehow she manages in that essay to keep, you know, there's a very delicate balance between this kind of sorrow and this joy, and it's the joy that kind of keeps you going, or keeps things moving, keeps the transformation, keeps that memory also. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not grief work in order to forget, or grief
Okay.
work in order to it's
So
not
it's
about
not-
closure, not closure.
Yeah, it's not about closure. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of open up the speculative
Yes. Yeah.
realms and to speak about the different registers or tonalities, you know, that happen. Yeah.
Mm. And also very, very pragmatically, the hope that maybe some bureaucrat will actually get it. It's also, it's bait in that, we don't want to turn people off completely and say, look, listen, guys, there's this really cool stuff going down. And you didn't even interview half of these people when you did your focus groups. It's that.
That's the only Singaporean in this group. I would just say that's not, well, how do I put it? Like, that's not anything out of the ordinary.
Yeah, I know. But we can always hope that one
We can always hope one day that there would be a geographer or a horticulturist or a person who listens to the spaces, in a different way that would actually like understand, as opposed to, one that through the whole colonial law.
What are we hearing? Is that Hugo?
Speaking of tonality, yes. But I'm totally like, I'm totally, with you as to like how we map things and how we think about this. And one of the very interesting ideas or considerations that was actually made during the very early part, I think was about last January, was it, Grace? I can remember when we first started. We were visiting a site called the Kabuyaran, which is the former airport of Jakarta. And it's been deused, like basically it's only been used for shooting horror films and drama and TV dramas. So it's like something that came out of the 50s, 60s, the whole notion of progress, the whole idea of aviation being like, it's a bit like Kallang Airport in that sense, the first modernization of the city. And when we were told that that would be possible or prospective, we were also thinking how to work with the site, because once the humans have left, a lot of things have changed. Like once there isn't a permanent activity or active use of the site, it just changes. For one, like we had this like very interesting encounter where Grace, me, and Farah, the artistic director, we were just sitting like, on the ground floor, which is predominantly in the conceptualization of airports would be like the departure and the arrival hall. And over there was occupied by a group of wild goats that were actually like roaming because that was their land. And then they were like going like, what the hell are these humans doing here? And we were thinking, I was like, how do you conceptualize the space? Since the curatorial is so much about the language of space and responding not just to the human history, but now, the contemporary history or this like use of these residents who have taken over. And we were kind of considering at one point whether to move like more of the human activities to the second and the third floor, so not to intervene with these animal residents of the space. But we were also wondering like what kind of workshops or what kind of activities we could get to actually kind of think of an ecosystem of the past, present, and maybe in some hope the future, because like, as you know, Biennales have a very particular language in terms of temporality and significance as to like what they hark, in terms of capitalism, gentrification. So we were thinking about along those lines itself. Not that this is a provocation, but like also like thinking about like how exhibitions or like, or artistic production beyond just artworks, but exhibitions, how that also influence the ecosystem, because in many sense, like large scale exhibitions these days, particularly on the fringes or what we consider like peripheral, like not to use the word peripheral and centers, have become this kind of tools that in some way addresses the human need to be seen as the first world nation, but not so much of these other ecosystems that we speak about, and whether we should just not think about exhibitions in a fixed temporality. Yeah.
I think I can continue to that a little bit, just going back to what Lucy and Philippa was talking about. I was thinking of several keywords, especially illusion with E. How am I pronouncing it right? And where's my notes? Oh, and I was thinking of like non-representational practice. Even if you use recording devices like sound recording or image recording, but the intention is not to capture or to freeze, is not to represent, but I think Philippa was saying something like to be with. So I try to avoid the word create because it sounds pretty godly. So you make something that people can be with, people can experience by all means of senses. Meanwhile, at certain points, well, if it's a cinematic piece, then you know that it will be shown in a black box kind of cinema. But in other works, you make work with no complete control of how it will be shown or how you will allow people to, you and whoever who invites you to show will sort of allow the kind of experiencing of what you make. And when I think of this like illusion and non-representational practices, I also would like to think about, I never thought of it as grief, so it's a keyword that I think I need to think about. But I have never thought of any practice as ever ending. So even if you probably some artists would be able to say, okay, this is a group of theme, like these are my works that speaks of gender, for example, or whatever ecological things. Even if there are people who do that, but I think if one grows as a human being, then it everything will meet at certain point, which is why I think it never ends. The practice never ends. That always makes me question, like, how do we make exhibitions? How do we I don't know, how do we create these chances of encounter or chances of experiencing works? How do we make this, I don't know, place where people can be with the work?
Absolutely. No, totally.
So we're down to the last 15 minutes, and I just wanted to have a bit of a check-in to see whether we have any questions from Facebook or Zoom or whatever. So
yeah, multiple incarnation in different social media platforms.
That's happening.
How do we check it? Oh, Rachel and Chita is checking it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So we're kind of clear. I guess like no one has questions going on. But anyway, I'd just like to say that it's been an honor to have all of you here. And if there was a way that we could ever sit down and have a meal again, oh, okay. I think it would be great. Of course, like, Lucy, Philippa, anytime in my new place. I would love to have you. Francis has been here a few times. Yeah. And hopefully, like, I do, like, the new project sounds really great, like Lucy. I really hope to see it in person. And of course, like, thank you all for your contributions. So I guess, like, if there are any other questions, should we just have a wrap up for the day?
Thank you so much, Chinyi, Fengsu, and Grace for inviting us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Philippa and Lucy. Thank you so much. I think we're occupying your lunch hour. I hope you're not you'll suffer from the sugar low and
More than an hour, I must say. I'm really sorry.
Really appreciate for having this gathering. And I mean, thank you again, Jakarta Biennale curatorial team, Grace and Chinyi, to indulge allow us to have this moment. To really come together and just share thoughts and our adore to, I think, for Lucy's wonderful new film. And big congratulations again for this
For the
truly,
prize.
yeah, for the prize.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a real honor and really fun as well. So thank you.
Yeah.